In 2021, archaeologists at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea carefully opened a wicker basket. It had been sitting there, underwater, for 2,400 years. When they looked inside, they found something that shouldn't exist. Fruit. Doum nuts and grape seeds from the 4th century before the Common Era, preserved as if someone had just packed them for lunch and never came back. Picture that moment. You're 30 feet underwater, surrounded by the murky blue-green of the Mediterranean. You've just discovered this basket in what appears to be some kind of underground chamber. The wicker itself is ancient, fragile. You carefully open it, not knowing what you'll find. And there's fruit inside, not mineralized, not fossilized, just preserved. Doum nuts from sacred African palms that ancient Egyptians considered holy. Grape seeds that could have been harvested last season, except they weren't. They were harvested around 350 BCE. Now, finding ancient artifacts underwater isn't unusual. Archaeologists pull up pottery and coins and ship fragments all the time. Those materials can survive for millennia underwater. But fruit? Organic material that should have decomposed within years, maybe decades at most? That's extraordinary. That's the kind of discovery that makes you question everything you thought you knew about preservation and time. But here's what makes this truly mind-bending. That basket was sitting in a city that had been completely erased from human memory for over 1,000 years. A city so thoroughly forgotten that most historians thought it was a myth, a legend, something ancient writers made up or confused with other places. For 12 centuries, this city existed only in fragments of old texts and rare inscriptions that most scholars dismissed. And then, at the turn of this century, archaeologists found it. Not buried under desert sand, like you might expect from ancient Egypt. Not hidden in some remote location. It was right there, just 4 miles off the coast, resting under 30 feet of water. The city was called Heracleion, and before it vanished, it wasn't just important. It was essential. For hundreds of years, it was Egypt's most powerful Mediterranean port. Every single Greek ship entering Egypt had to stop here first. It was mandatory. If you wanted to trade with Egypt, you came through Heracleion. More than that, this was a sacred place. Pharaohs traveled here to receive divine authority. Religious festivals drew thousands. The city sat at the intersection of Egyptian and Greek culture, a melting pot where gods were reinterpreted and traditions blended. And then, nothing. The city sank beneath the waves sometime between the 2nd and 8th century CE, and over time, people simply forgot it had ever existed, until someone found that temple base in the year 2000. If you're enjoying this journey into the depths of forgotten history, hit that like button and subscribe. There's so much more waiting beneath the surface. So how does a major city, a place where pharaohs became gods, where international trade flowed, where thousands of people lived and worked, just disappear from human knowledge? And how on earth did a wicker basket full of fruit survive at the bottom of the sea for over 2,000 years? To answer those questions, we need to talk about what archaeologists have found down there. And I'm not talking about a few scattered ruins. I'm talking about colossal 16-foot statues of gods, dozens of ancient shipwrecks perfectly preserved, temples and sanctuaries, coins and jewelry, entire streets laid out exactly as they were when the ground beneath them stopped being ground. Because here's the thing about Heracleion. The same catastrophe that destroyed it also preserved it. When the city sank, it didn't burn or get ransacked or slowly crumble over centuries. It got sealed, buried under layers of sand and silt from the Nile, protected from oxygen and decay. It became a time capsule. And that fruit basket? It was found in an underground chamber that got closed off somehow around 400 BCE and never reopened. The city continued functioning for hundreds of years after that chamber was sealed, but whatever was in there stayed locked away, preserved in conditions so stable that even the organic material survived. We still don't fully understand what ceremony or ritual led to that chamber being sealed. That's one of the mysteries that remains, but that's also part of what makes Heracleion so fascinating. After 25 years of excavation work, archaeologists have explored about 5% of the city. 5%. The rest is still down there, waiting, holding secrets. Historians estimate it'll take another 200 years to fully excavate what's been discovered so far. 200 years. Think about that. A city lost for 1,200 years will take 200 years to fully rediscover. We're at the very beginning of understanding what Heracleion was and what happened to it. And every year, new discoveries surface, literally. In 2021, it was those fruit baskets. In the same year, they found a 25-meter Ptolemaic warship, perfectly preserved because it had been trapped under fallen temple blocks. Before that, colossal statues. Before that, ancient boats that matched descriptions written by Herodotus in 450 BCE, descriptions so accurate that when archaeologists found the actual ships, they realized the ancient historian had gotten every detail right. This isn't just history, it's an active archaeological thriller, unfolding in real time. Tonight, we're going to explore the story of Heracleion, how it rose to become Egypt's gateway to the Mediterranean world, why it mattered so much to both Egyptians and Greeks, what catastrophic forces pulled it beneath the waves, and how a French archaeologist searching for Napoleon's lost warships stumbled onto one of the most remarkable discoveries in modern archaeology. We'll talk about the ground that turned to liquid, the god of flooding who drowned when his own city sank, the Helen of Troy connection that changes one of history's most famous stories, and we'll consider what it means that a city this important could simply vanish from human memory for over a millennium. But to understand how a lunchbox could survive at the bottom of the sea for over 2,000 years, we need to talk about the city that surrounded it. A city that, for hundreds of years, didn't just exist, it was the gateway to an empire. And then it vanished so completely that people forgot it was ever real. Let's go back to when Heracleion was alive. Picture Egypt around the 6th century BC. The age of the Pharaohs is in its twilight, but Egypt is still a powerhouse, still wealthy, still attracting traders and travelers from across the Mediterranean world. And if you're Greek and you want to trade with Egypt, there's only one way in: through Heracleion. It wasn't optional. It was the law. Every Greek ship entering Egypt from the Mediterranean had to pass through this port city. It was Egypt's customs office, its international gateway, its filter for everything and everyone coming from the Greek world. Think about what that means. For hundreds of years, this was one of the most important trade hubs in the ancient world. Ships from Athens, from Sparta, from colonies across the Mediterranean, they all funneled through here. Goods flowed both ways. Ideas traveled. Cultures mixed. The Egyptians called it Thonis. The Greeks called it Heracleion. And for a very long time, historians didn't realize these were the same place. In ancient texts, both names appeared. Herodotus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century BCE, mentioned Heracleion. He told stories about what happened there, described its temples, talked about its significance. Later Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, also referenced it. But there were also Egyptian texts mentioning a city called Thonis, an important port, a sacred site. For centuries, scholars debated, were these two separate cities Was one a district of the other? Had ancient writers confused their geography? Some historians thought Heracleion was mythical, that Herodotus had embellished or invented it, the way ancient writers sometimes did. Others thought maybe it had existed, but was actually another city that we already knew about, just called by a different name in Greek sources. The problem was simple. Nobody could find it. Archaeologists had mapped the Egyptian coast. They'd excavated sites all along the Nile Delta. They'd found other ancient ports, other cities from the same era. But Heracleion, Thonis, nothing definitive. No ruins, no temple foundations, no grand monuments. So the city became something of a legend, a place that existed in texts but nowhere else. The ancient world's version of Atlantis, except that actual historians had written about it. And then, in the year 2000, someone found a stone tablet underwater. It was a stela, commemorative stone, erected by Pharaoh Nectanebo I around 380 BCE, and carved into that stone was an order. The pharaoh commanded that the stele be placed in the city of Thonis at the temple of Heracleion. One sentence, one artifact. And suddenly, centuries of scholarly debate dissolved. Thonis and Heracleion weren't two cities. They were one city with two names. The Egyptians had called it one thing. The Greeks had called it another. And for over a millennium after the city vanished, we'd been searching for two places when there had only ever been one. But finding that stele didn't just solve a naming puzzle. It confirmed something more important. Heracleion had been real, and it had been right where the ancient sources said it should be, at the mouth of the canopic branch of the Nile, guarding Egypt's western Mediterranean coast. So what was this place? Really? Imagine a city built on adjoining islands in the Nile Delta, crisscrossed by canals, boats moving between temples, and warehouses and residential districts. It earned the nickname Venice of the Nile, and for good reason. Water wasn't just around the city, it was threaded through it. At its peak, during the 6th through 4th centuries BCE, this was more than just a port, it was a cultural crossroads. Egyptians and Greeks didn't just pass through each other's territories here. They lived together, worked together, worshipped together sometimes. The Greeks were allowed to settle in Heracleion during what's called Egypt's late period. They built their own sanctuaries, conducted their own religious rites, but they also participated in Egyptian ceremonies. They traded with Egyptian merchants. They adopted and adapted. You can see this fusion in what archaeologists have found. Colossal Egyptian statues standing near Greek pottery, silver ceremonial instruments, alongside gold jewelry crafted in Greek styles, ships built using techniques from both cultures. It was a place where gods got translated, where the Egyptian moon god Khonsu became associated with the Greek hero Heracles, where religious festivals celebrated both Egyptian and Greek traditions, where pharaohs came to receive divine authority in Egyptian temples, while Greek traders watched and participated in the ceremonies. For a city that would later be completely forgotten, Heracleion was remarkably cosmopolitan, and it lasted for centuries, from its founding around the 8th century BCE through the height of pharaonic Egypt, through the Persian conquest, through Alexander the Great's arrival in 331 BCE. But when Alexander founded Alexandria just down the coast, something changed. Alexandria was new, planned, built to be a grand Mediterranean capital. It had better harbors, more strategic positioning, and it had the backing of the new Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander's death. Slowly, trade shifted. Ships that once had to stop at Heracleion could now sail directly to Alexandria. The obligatory port status was transferred. What had been essential became optional. Heracleion didn't disappear overnight. It continued as a regional center, a religious site, a functioning city, but it was no longer the gateway, no longer the first stop, no longer indispensable. And then the ground beneath it started to fail. We'll talk more about how and why later. But between the 2nd century BCE and the 8th century CE, through a combination of earthquakes, flooding, and a phenomenon called soil liquefaction, Heracleion slowly sank beneath the Mediterranean. Some residents stayed even as the city subsided. Archaeological evidence shows people living there into the early Arab period. But gradually, inevitably, the sea won. By the end of the 8th century CE, Heracleion was gone. And then something even stranger happened. People forgot, not immediately, not all at once, but over generations, over centuries, the memory faded. Without visible ruins, without ongoing habitation, without a reason to talk about it, Heracleion slipped from living memory into historical footnote, then from footnote to legend, then from legend to question mark. For 1,200 years, one of ancient Egypt's most important ports existed only in scattered references in ancient texts, references that most modern scholars dismissed or misunderstood, until that stele was pulled from the Mediterranean, proving that everything the ancient historians had written was true. The city was real, the temples were real, the ceremonies, the trade, the cultural fusion, all of it had happened, exactly where the sources said it had. It had just been waiting at the bottom of the ocean the entire time. But Heracleion wasn't just any port city. It wasn't just a place where ships docked and goods changed hands. It was sacred ground. To understand why losing this city was like losing a piece of Egypt's soul, we need to talk about what actually happened here. What ceremonies took place. What these temples meant. Why pharaohs made the journey to this particular spot on the Mediterranean coast. At the heart of Heracleion stood the temple of Amun-Gareb. Amun was one of ancient Egypt's most powerful gods, the hidden one, the king of the gods. His temples existed throughout Egypt, but the one in Heracleion served a very specific, very important purpose. This was where pharaohs came to receive divine authority. Not metaphorically, not symbolically in the way we might use those terms today. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, the pharaoh wasn't just a political leader. He was a living god, a bridge between the mortal and divine realms, the embodiment of cosmic order. But that divine status needed to be confirmed, legitimized, officially recognized by the gods themselves. And that happened here, in Heracleion's temple of Amun. The pharaoh would make the journey to this coastal city. He would enter the temple, and through ceremonies we don't fully understand, he would receive what ancient sources describe as his divine authority as universal ruler. Think about what that means for Heracleion's importance. This wasn't just a religious site among many. This was where earthly power became divine, where human kings became god kings, where the right to rule all of Egypt was established and confirmed. No wonder the city mattered so much. But the Temple of Amun wasn't the only sacred space in Heracleion. Every year, during the month the Egyptians called Khoiak, roughly corresponding to our October or November, the city hosted one of ancient Egypt's most important religious festivals, the Mysteries of Osiris. Osiris was the god of the dead, of resurrection, of the afterlife. His mythology centered on death and rebirth. According to Egyptian belief, Osiris had been murdered by his brother Set, dismembered, scattered, but his wife Isis gathered the pieces and brought him back to life, making him ruler of the underworld. The mysteries of Osiris reenacted this story, not as theater exactly, more like a sacred drama, a ritual that participants believed had real power, real significance, and Heracleion played a central role. During the festival, ceremonial boats would process from Heracleion to the nearby city of Canopus, carrying statues of the gods, offerings, sacred objects. Priests would perform elaborate rituals. Thousands would gather to watch, to participate, to witness the gods' presence among them. These weren't quiet, private ceremonies. They were spectacular public events. Imagine the streets filled with people, the canals crowded with decorated boats, the sound of chanting, music, ritual proclamations echoing across the water. For those few days each year, Heracleion became the center of the Egyptian religious world. And here's where things get really interesting. The Greeks participated in these ceremonies too. Remember, Greeks were allowed to settle in Heracleion. They built their own sanctuaries. Yes, they maintained their own religious traditions, but they also engaged with Egyptian religion in ways that were surprisingly deep. This wasn't just tolerance, it was synthesis. The Greeks would look at Egyptian gods and see parallels with their own deities. They'd reinterpret, adapt, blend. Scholars call this religious syncretism, the merging of different belief systems into something new. In Heracleion, you can see this happening in real time through the archaeological evidence. The Egyptian god Khonsu, a lunar deity associated with time and healing, became identified with the Greek hero Heracles. The city's Greek name, Heracleion, likely comes from this association. To the Greeks, this was a place connected to Heracles, their greatest hero. But the Egyptians still worshipped Khonsu in the traditional way, and both groups seemed to coexist, to share sacred spaces, to participate in each other's festivals. Archaeologists have found evidence of this fusion everywhere. Egyptian colossal statues standing near Greek pottery, bronze statuettes of Osiris with gold sheet eyes, a distinctly Egyptian style, found alongside Greek ceremonial vessels, ship construction techniques that combine Egyptian flat-bottom designs with Greek mortise and tenon joinery. Even in daily life, the cultural mixing was constant. Greek merchants living in Egyptian-style houses, Egyptian artisans creating objects for Greek patrons, children growing up bilingual, learning both cultures' stories and traditions. The city became a living example of what happens when two great civilizations don't just encounter each other, but genuinely intermingle. And this wasn't forced. It wasn't colonial imposition. During the late period of Egyptian history, from about 660 to 330 BCE, the Greeks were invited to settle, to trade, to participate. The relationship was relatively equal. Both sides brought something valuable. Both sides gained from the exchange. You could almost imagine walking through Heracleion at its height. You'd hear multiple languages in the market, see ships from across the Mediterranean unloading cargo, watch Egyptian priests conducting ceremonies while Greek merchants looked on with respect, perhaps participating in ways that honored both traditions. You might witness a procession during the mysteries of Osiris, where sacred boats, gilded with gold and painted with vibrant colors, moved through the canals, carrying the statues of gods whose names you knew in two languages. You might see a pharaoh arriving for his divine confirmation, surrounded by retinue and ritual, about to step into the temple of Amun and emerge as something more than human. This was a city where power was legitimized, where gods walked, or at least where people believed they did, where different worlds, Egyptian and Greek, sacred and commercial, tradition and innovation, existed not in conflict, but in conversation. That's what makes the loss of Heracleion so profound. We didn't just lose a city. We lost a record of cultural fusion that took centuries to develop. We lost temples where ceremonies we still don't fully understand took place. We lost the physical evidence of how two of history's greatest civilizations learned to live together, worship together, build together. For 1,200 years, all of that was gone. Buried not just under water and silt, but under time itself. Erased from memory, reduced to fragments and ancient texts that most modern scholars thought were exaggerations or myths. And then someone found a temple foundation 30 feet underwater and started pulling up statues and boats and offerings. And slowly, piece by piece, that lost world started coming back into view. But before we get to the discovery, there's one more story we need to tell. A story that connects Heracleion to perhaps the most famous tale in all of Greek mythology. Because according to some ancient sources, Helen of Troy never actually made it to Troy. She made it to Egypt, possibly to Heracleion itself. And that changes everything we think we know about the Trojan War. Everyone knows the story of the Trojan War. Paris, the Trojan prince, falls in love with Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. Never mind that she's already married to King Menelaus of Sparta. Paris and Helen run away together, or he kidnaps her, depending on which version you hear. The Greeks are furious. Helen's husband wants her back. But more than that, this is an insult to Greek honor. So they assemble the greatest military expedition the ancient world has ever seen. 1,000 ships. The best warriors from every Greek kingdom. Achilles, Ajax, Odysseus. They sail to Troy and lay siege to the city. For 10 years, they fight. Heroes die. Cities burn. The war becomes legendary, immortalized in Homer's Iliad, one of the foundations of Western literature. And at the center of it all is Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships, the woman over whom civilizations went to war. Except, according to Herodotus, she was never there. Here's the version of the story that Herodotus tells, based on what he learned from Egyptian priests during his travels in the 5th century BCE. Paris and Helen flee Sparta together. That part's the same. They board a ship, planning to sail back to Troy, but then strong winds blow them off course. This happened frequently in ancient Mediterranean sailing. You couldn't always control where you ended up. The winds and currents made the decisions. So Paris's ship, instead of heading east toward Troy, gets pushed south to Egypt, specifically to the mouth of the Nile, right where Heracleion stood as Egypt's gateway port. Now, remember, every Greek ship entering Egypt had to pass through Heracleion. It was the law, and this gave Egyptian authorities the chance to inspect cargo, collect customs, and generally keep track of who was coming and going. So when Paris's ship arrives, Egyptian officials board it for inspection. And this is where the story gets interesting. According to Herodotus, some of Paris's own servants, the people he'd brought with him from Troy, informed the Egyptians about what had actually happened. This wasn't a romantic elopement. This was a kidnapping. Paris had stolen Helen from her husband. He'd violated the sacred laws of hospitality. The Egyptians were appalled. They brought Paris before the Pharaoh, who basically said, "You've committed a serious crime. You violated guest friendship, one of the most sacred bonds in the ancient world. You stole another man's wife and his property." The Pharaoh's judgment was simple. Helen would stay in Egypt. She'd be safe, protected, treated with the honor due to a queen. But she wasn't going to Troy. When her husband Menelaus came looking for her, and the Pharaoh assumed Helen would be returned to him. As for Paris, he could leave. take his ships, take his ill-gotten treasure if he wanted. But Helen stayed. So according to this version of events, Paris sailed to Troy alone. And then the Greek army showed up. Imagine being Menelaus. You've assembled this massive military coalition. You've convinced kings and warriors from across the Greek world to join you. You've sailed across the Mediterranean with 1,000 ships. You've laid siege to one of the most powerful cities in Asia Minor, all to get your wife back. And the Trojans keep telling you, she's not here. She never was. She's in Egypt. Would you believe them? Probably not. You'd think it was a trick, a desperate lie from a city under siege. Of course they'd say she's not there. Of course they'd claim she's somewhere else. So, the war continues. For 10 years, the Greeks destroy Troy. They kill Paris. They burn the city to the ground. They achieve total victory. And Helen still isn't there. Because according to Herodotus, she was in Egypt the whole time, possibly in Heracleion itself, possibly in the Pharaoh's court, living as an honored guest, waiting for her husband to realize where she actually was. Eventually, after the war, after the destruction, after a decade of pointless fighting, Menelaus finally sails to Egypt. And there she is, safe, protected, just like the Pharaoh promised. Now, is this version true? We don't know for certain. Homer's version is earlier, more famous, more deeply embedded in Western cultural memory. The Iliad doesn't mention any Egyptian detour. In that telling, Helen is in Troy throughout the war, conflicted and miserable, but definitely present. But Herodotus wasn't making this up out of nowhere. He specifically says he got this version from Egyptian priests. It was apparently a well-known alternative tradition in Egypt, a story they told about their own role in the legendary war. And here's what makes it fascinating from Heracleion's perspective. This story would have been told in the city itself. Imagine living in Heracleion during the classical period. You're Greek or Egyptian, or maybe a bit of both. You know the story of the Trojan War. Everyone does. It's already legendary. But you also know your city's version. The story about how Helen stayed here. How Egyptian justice and hospitality prevented a kidnapped queen from being taken to Troy. How the whole war was technically fought over nothing. There might have been a specific temple or site associated with the story, a place where Helen supposedly stayed. Maybe it was shown to visitors. Maybe it was part of the local pride look. The most famous woman in Greek mythology was here, in our city, protected by Egyptian law. We'll never know exactly what the people of Heracleion believed, but the story was connected to this place, and that connection adds another layer to what was lost when the city sank. It's not just that we lost temples and trade records and artifacts. We lost the local traditions, the stories people told about their own city, the ways they connected themselves to the great myths and legends of their time. When Heracleion disappeared, those stories went with it. And for 1,200 years, we had no way to know what had been said there, what had been believed, what versions of famous stories the city's residents had passed down through generations. The Helen story is just one example, but it illustrates something important about Heracleion. This was a city that existed at the intersection of Egyptian and Greek worlds, a place where both cultures' stories, myths, and traditions mixed and evolved. That makes it irreplaceable. And it makes the discovery of Heracleion so much more than just finding ruins underwater. Every artifact that comes up tells us something about how these cultures interacted. Every inscription gives us a fragment of what was said and believed in this crossroads city. Every statue, every ship, every sealed chamber adds to our understanding of a world that existed in the space between civilizations. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We've talked about what Heracleion was, why it mattered, what happened there, what stories were told about it. Now we need to talk about how anyone found it in the first place. Because searching for a lost city at the bottom of the Mediterranean is harder than it sounds. It takes technology, persistence, money, expertise, and a bit of luck. It took a French archaeologist 5 years of searching before he found anything. And the tool that finally revealed the city was technology developed for nuclear research. Let's jump forward to 1996. A French underwater archaeologist named Franck Godiot is preparing for what will become the most important search of his career. He's not looking for Heracleion. Not yet. Most people still think Heracleion is either mythical or hopelessly lost. Godiot has a different target in mind. He's searching for Napoleon's fleet. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt as part of his grand strategy to challenge British power in the region. He brought an army, yes, but he also brought scholars, scientists, artists, the seeds of Egyptology itself. The campaign was meant to be glorious. It didn't work out that way. At the Battle of the Nile, in Aboukir Bay, just off the Egyptian coast, British naval forces under Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed most of the French fleet. Ships sank. Napoleon's connection to France was severed. The campaign eventually collapsed. But those sunken ships remained somewhere in Aboukir Bay, and Godiot wanted to find them. Now, Godiot wasn't a traditional archaeologist. He'd founded the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology back in 1987. His approach combined serious scholarship with cutting-edge technology. He didn't just dive and hope to stumble across ruins. He mapped. He measured. He used tools that most archaeologists at the time hadn't even heard of. The key technology was something called nuclear magnetic resonance magnetometry. I know that sounds intimidating, but here's what it actually means. The equipment was developed by the French Atomic Energy Commission. It measures Earth's magnetic field thousands of times per second, and it can detect tiny anomalies, variations in that field, caused by metal objects, stone structures, anything that creates a different magnetic signature than the surrounding environment. Think of it like an incredibly sensitive metal detector, except it can see through 30 feet of water and several more feet of mud and silt. It can detect the outline of a buried ship, the foundation of a temple, a scatter of ancient anchors, all without digging, all without even being able to see them. It's the archaeological equivalent of X-ray vision. Using this technology, Godiot and his team spent 5 years methodically surveying Aboukir Bay. They covered an area 11 kilometers by 15 kilometers. That's a massive amount of ocean floor to search. But they did it systematically, passing the magnetometers over every section, recording every anomaly, building up a map of what lay beneath the silt. And they did find Napoleon's ships. Eventually, some of them, at least. But in the process of searching, in the year 2000, the magnetometers detected something else. Something that shouldn't be there. It was too big to be a shipwreck. The wrong shape. The magnetic signature suggested stone, not just wood and metal. And it was in a location that didn't make sense for Napoleon's fleet. When the team investigated, they found the base of a temple. Not French, not from the 18th century. Ancient, Egyptian. Massive. At first, they probably didn't realize what they discovered. Just another archaeological site, interesting, but not necessarily groundbreaking. Ancient ruins dot the Egyptian coast. This could have been anything. But as they explored further, as they found more structures, more statues, more inscriptions, the realization started to build. This wasn't just a temple, it was a city. And not just any city. The inscriptions, when they were translated, kept mentioning two names, Faunus and Heracleion, the city that historians had debated for centuries, the port that Herodotus described, the sacred site that had vanished from human knowledge for over a millennium. It had been here the entire time, right here, in the exact area where ancient sources said it should be, just 30 feet below the surface of the Mediterranean, covered by sand and silt, waiting. There's something almost poetic about how it was discovered. Gaudio wasn't looking for Heracleion. He was looking for something from 200 years ago. And in the process, he found something from 2,000 years ago. It's like searching your attic for a box of old photographs and finding a hidden room you never knew existed. The discovery made headlines in archaeological circles. Here was a major ancient city, completely intact, perfectly preserved, that we'd lost entirely. It would be as if someone found Pompeii after historians had spent centuries thinking it was just a legend. But finding the city was just the beginning. Understanding it would take decades. Underwater archaeology is incredibly difficult. On land, you can set up a grid, carefully excavate layer by layer, document everything in detail. Underwater, you're working in near darkness. Visibility is often just a few feet. The silt gets disturbed with every movement. You can only stay down for limited periods, and you have to bring everything to the surface to properly examine it. Plus, there's the sheer scale of the problem. Heracleion is huge, 3.5 square kilometers. For comparison, Pompeii is about 1.2 square kilometers, and it's been excavated for over 250 years and still isn't fully explored. Heracleion is 3 times that size, and it's underwater. And it's covered in protective layers of silt that have to be carefully removed without destroying the artifacts beneath. Gaudio estimated early on that fully excavating the site would take 200 years of continuous work. He's been at it for 25 years now, and by his own estimate, they've uncovered about 5% of the city. 5%. That means 95% is still down there, still waiting, still holding secrets that we won't discover for generations. And Gaudio's team has adopted a particular philosophy about this. They call it learn as much as we can by touching as little as we can. The idea is simple. Every time you excavate something, you destroy the archaeological context. You remove it from where it's been resting for millennia. You can't undo that. So before you dig, you need to be absolutely certain that you can learn from what you're uncovering, that you can preserve it properly, that you're not just satisfying curiosity. And sometimes the best choice is to leave things buried, to document them, to record their location, and then to wait, to let future archaeologists with better technology, better preservation techniques, better understanding, do the actual excavation. It's a patient approach, almost unbelievably patient. But when you're dealing with a site this important, this well-preserved, this irreplaceable, patience makes sense. The discovery of Heracleion changed underwater archaeology. It proved that major ancient cities could survive intact at the bottom of relatively shallow seas. It demonstrated that magnetometry could find what traditional methods couldn't. And it showed that sometimes the most important discoveries come from looking for something else entirely. Napoleon probably never imagined that his military disaster in Aboukir Bay would lead 200 years later to the rediscovery of a lost Egyptian city. But that's exactly what happened. The warships that Gaudio was searching for led him to something far more valuable. Not to diminish the historical importance of Napoleon's fleet, but Heracleion is in a different category entirely. It's a window into a world we thought was gone forever. And what Gaudio found beneath those 30 feet of water was extraordinary. not just because of what survived, but because of how it survived. To understand that, we need to talk about what happened when the ground beneath Heracleion stopped being ground. There's a phenomenon that most people have experienced without knowing what it's called. Imagine you're at the beach. You're building a sandcastle right where the waves meet the sand. At first, the ground seems solid enough. You can pack the sand, shape it, build on it. But then a wave comes in. Water saturates the sand beneath your castle, and suddenly, the ground isn't solid anymore. It becomes fluid, loose. Your castle doesn't crack or crumble, it sinks. It settles down into the sand like something slowly dissolving into liquid. That's soil liquefaction on a small scale. In Heracleion, it happened on a scale that's almost impossible to imagine. The Nile Delta, where the city was built, is made primarily of clay. Dense clay sediments deposited over thousands of years by the Nile River's flooding. When that clay is dry or stable, it's incredibly strong. You can build massive stone temples on it, erect colossal statues weighing 50 tons, create a city that lasts for centuries. But that clay has a weakness. It's water saturated. The entire delta is essentially built on layers of sediment that are filled with water. And when certain stresses hit that sediment, like an earthquake, or sudden flooding, or the weight of heavy structures shifting, something changes at the molecular level. The clay loses its strength. The particles that were locked together, creating a solid foundation, suddenly aren't locked anymore. They can move, flow, act like liquid instead of solid ground. It's called liquefaction, and it's what destroyed Heracleion. Geological studies of the area, done in collaboration with Gaudio's archaeological work, showed clear evidence of this phenomenon. When researchers took soil samples from beneath the ruins, they found signs of the clay volume loss that happens during liquefaction events. They found evidence of sudden collapse, of structures settling rapidly into the ground beneath them. And they found something else: active fault lines running through the Nile Delta. The eastern Mediterranean is geologically active. Not as dramatic as, say, the Pacific Ring of Fire, but there are fault lines. Earthquakes happen. Historical records from the late Roman and early Arab periods document significant seismic activity in the region. One of these earthquakes hit the Nile Delta, maybe several of them, over the centuries. The ground shook. And in areas where the clay was already stressed under the weight of massive temples, enormous stone statues, dense urban construction, that shaking was enough to trigger liquefaction. The ground stopped being ground. Picture what that would have looked like. You're in Heracleion. Maybe it's the 2nd century BCE. The city is still functioning, still important, though Alexandria has taken some of its prominence. You're walking through streets you've known your entire life, and then the earth moves. At first, it's an earthquake. Frightening, yes, but not necessarily catastrophic. Buildings might crack. Some structures might collapse, but earthquakes happen. You rebuild. Life continues, except this time, something different happens. The ground beneath the city's heaviest structures, the temples, the statue bases, the monumental architecture, begins to fail. Not all at once, not everywhere, but in certain areas, the clay simply gives way. A colossal statue, one of those 16-foot representations of gods that took dozens of workers to erect, starts to sink, slowly at first, then faster. It tilts, settles, disappears into the earth like it's being swallowed. Temple foundations that have been stable for centuries suddenly aren't. Buildings start to lean, to sink, to collapse, not from structural failure, but because the ground beneath them is flowing away. And there's nothing anyone can do about it. You can't stop liquefaction once it starts. You can't shore up the ground or reinforce the foundations. The very substance of the earth has changed. What was solid is now fluid, and everything built on it is going down. But here's what's important. This didn't happen overnight. Heracleion didn't sink in, a single catastrophic event. It was a process, a slow-motion disaster that took centuries. The city started subsiding in the 2nd century BCE. Archaeological evidence shows that some structures sank while others remained relatively intact. Some areas of the city became uninhabitable while others continued functioning. It was gradual, uneven, relentless. People adapted as best they could. They abandoned certain districts, rebuilt in safer areas, probably developed an understanding that their city was slowly being claimed by the sea, even if they didn't understand the mechanism. Historical records suggest that some residents remained in Heracleion well into the Roman period, even into early Arab rule. They lived in a city that was actively drowning. Slowly, yes, but drowning nonetheless. Parts of the city would flood with seawater during high tides or storms. Buildings that had once been well above the waterline were now at risk. The canal network that had made the city the Venice of the Nile became more literal, except now it was salt water from the Mediterranean creeping in, not just fresh water from the Nile. By the 8th century CE, the process was complete. Whatever remained above water was abandoned. The sea claimed the rest, and layers of sand and silt from the Nile began covering everything that had sunk. Here's the irony. The same process that destroyed Heracleion also preserved it. When structures sink into liquefied clay and then get covered by layers of silt, they're protected, sealed away from oxygen, from corrosion, from the kind of decay that affects ruins exposed to air and weather. Wood that would normally rot survives. Colors on statues remain vivid. Organic materials like fruit in sealed chambers can last for millennia. The mud and silt from the Nile created a protective blanket. What buried Heracleion also kept it intact, like a massive underwater time capsule. If the city had simply been abandoned and left on dry land, it would have been looted, dismantled for building materials, weathered by rain and wind. After 1,200 years, there would be almost nothing left. Instead, because it sank, because it got sealed under protective layers, Heracleion remained waiting, perfectly preserved in ways that even Pompeii wasn't. And when Gaudio's team started bringing artifacts to the surface, the level of preservation was extraordinary. They found statues with their original colors still visible, ships with their construction details intact, inscriptions crisp enough to read after 2,400 years underwater, and yes, fruit in baskets, as if time had simply stopped the day the chamber was sealed. The forces that destroyed Heracleion, earthquakes, liquefaction, flooding, created the conditions that preserved it. It's a strange kind of balance, destruction and preservation, happening together. The ground turning to liquid, swallowing a city, and in the process protecting it from everything else that might have erased it from existence. And that means what Gaudio found wasn't just ruins. It was a snapshot, a frozen moment, a city captured in the process of its own disappearance. When the team started bringing those snapshots to the surface, the scale of what they discovered became clear. We're not talking about fragments. We're talking about whole statues, complete ships, entire temple foundations, the physical remains of a civilization, preserved in ways we rarely get to see, including some of the most remarkable statues ever found in ancient Egypt. 16 feet tall, weighing tons, representations of gods who had watched over Heracleion for centuries before joining it at the bottom of the Mediterranean. When you're excavating underwater, you can't see very far. Even in the best conditions, Visibility might be 10 or 15 feet. In Heracleion, working through layers of silt, it's often much less. You're essentially working in twilight, surrounded by particles suspended in water, your lights creating small spheres of illumination in the murky Mediterranean. So when Gaudio's team first discovered the colossal statues, they didn't see them all at once. They saw pieces, fragments, a hand here, a fold of carved stone drapery there. Slowly, as they cleared away the protective silt, the full scale of what they'd found became clear. These weren't life-sized statues. They were monuments, representations of gods meant to inspire awe even in a civilization that regularly built on a massive scale. The largest was a statue of Happy, 5.4 meters tall. That's just over 17.5 feet. Happy was the god of the Nile's annual flooding, the deity who controlled the most important natural phenomenon in Egyptian life. When the Nile flooded each year, it deposited fresh, fertile silt across the farmland. That flooding made Egyptian agriculture possible. It made Egyptian civilization possible. So Happy wasn't a minor god. He represented abundance, fertility, the very source of life itself. Ancient Egyptians typically depicted Hapi as androgynous, neither fully male nor fully female, well-fed, prosperous, carrying offerings of food and water. In statues and paintings, Hapi often appears with a ceremonial tray, laden with fish and vegetables and grain symbols of the Nile's bounty. And here was one of the largest representations of Hapi ever found, resting at the bottom of the Mediterranean, right where Heracleion once stood. The irony is almost poetic. Hapi, the god of flooding, drowned when his own city was consumed by water. The deity who represented controlled, beneficial inundation was overcome by uncontrolled, destructive submersion. You couldn't write a better metaphor for what happened to Heracleion. But Hapi wasn't alone down there. Near the colossal statue of Hapi, the team found representations of goddesses, Isis, possibly, other deities whose identifications are still being studied. These statues were also monumental in scale, carved from red granite and limestone, meant to stand in temple courtyards or processional ways where they would be seen by thousands during religious festivals. And there was a sphinx, perfectly preserved, the traditional Egyptian form human head, lion body that had symbolized royal power for thousands of years. When you see photographs of these statues resting on the seafloor, there's something deeply moving about them. They're covered in sediment, surrounded by the blue-green murk of underwater archaeology, but their features are still clear, still recognizable, still powerful. These weren't abstract shapes. They were meant to be seen as beings, as presences. The ancient Egyptians believed that statues could house the Cthulhu life force of the deity they represented. In a very real sense, these weren't just representations of gods. They were the gods, made manifest in stone. And they'd been resting at the bottom of the sea for well over 1,000 years. Bringing them to the surface was an enormous undertaking. The Hapi statue alone weighs several tons. You can't just lift something that size and that fragile straight out of the water. The process required careful planning, specialized equipment, months of preparation. First, the team had to fully excavate around the statue, removing all the protective silt without damaging the stone. Then they had to determine the statue's condition. Had the centuries underwater weakened the structure? Were there cracks, stress points, areas that might break during lifting? Then came the engineering challenge. How do you lift a 50-ton granite statue from 30 feet underwater without destroying it? They used lifting bags, cranes, support structures. The operation took weeks. And even once the statue reached the surface, the work wasn't done. The Hapi statue required 2.5 years of restoration. 2.5 years. Think about that. Some smaller artifacts from Heracleion could be cleaned and preserved in days or weeks. But this monument, this god statue that had survived the destruction of its city and 1,200 years underwater, needed years of painstaking care just to stabilize it for display. Conservators had to remove the salt that had penetrated the stone. They had to repair cracks caused by the pressure of being buried. They had to clean without removing the patina, the surface coloration that told the statue's story. And throughout it all, they had to respect what this object had been. Not just an artifact, not just a historical curiosity, but a sacred representation of a god who was worshipped by millions of people over thousands of years. The work was worth it. When the Hapi statue was finally ready for display, it became the centerpiece of Sunken Cities, a major exhibition that toured museums from London to Paris to Washington, D.C. Millions of people saw it. This god who had rested at the bottom of the Mediterranean for over a millennium was once again visible to human eyes. And the colors were still there. That's one of the most remarkable things about the preservation. On many of the statues and artifacts brought up from Heracleion, traces of the original paint remain. Reds and blues and golds. Vivid, bright, still recognizable after 2,400 years. Ancient Egyptian monuments were brightly colored. We know this intellectually, from traces of paint found on temple walls and pyramids. But we're used to seeing Egyptian artifacts in museums where they appear as bare stone or faded ruins. Heracleion's underwater preservation meant that some of that original vibrancy survived. When you look at certain artifacts from the site, you get a glimpse of what ancient Egypt actually looked like. Not the weathered beige of desert ruins, but the brilliant colors that the ancient Egyptians themselves would have seen. It changes your perception, makes the ancient world feel more immediate, more real. The statues weren't the only monumental finds, of course. The team discovered massive temple blocks, some weighing dozens of tons, foundation stones, still in their original positions, marking out the ground plans of sacred buildings, altars, offering tables, ceremonial vessels large enough that they had to be moved with special equipment. Each discovery added to the picture of what Heracleion had been, not just from historical texts or ancient accounts, but from the physical reality, the actual stones, the real objects, the tangible remains of a civilization. And with each artifact that surfaced, the same thought must have occurred to the archaeologists. If this is just 5% of the city, what else is down there? What other colossal statues are waiting beneath the silt? What other temples remain to be discovered? What other sacred objects, everyday tools, records of human life are still resting exactly where they settled when the ground beneath Heracleion turned to liquid? The statues that have been found are extraordinary, but they might be just a fraction of what remains, and that's both exciting and humbling. Exciting because it means the story of Heracleion is far from over. There are discoveries waiting that will change our understanding even further. Artifacts that will reveal aspects of Egyptian and Greek culture we didn't know existed. Humbling because it reminds us how much we don't know, how much of human history is still hidden, how much has been lost and might never be found. But for now, we have what's been brought to light. Gods rising from the deep, sacred objects returning to human sight, monuments that witnessed the height of an ancient civilization and then witnessed its slow disappearance beneath the waves. And standing among all those sacred statues and temple blocks, the team found something else, something that told a different story about Heracleion. They found ships, dozens of them, Ancient vessels, perfectly preserved, still resting where they sank over 2,000 years ago. Ancient ships don't usually survive. Wood rots, shipworms consume hulls, storms break up wrecks and scatter the pieces across the ocean floor. By the time 2,000 years have passed, you're lucky to find a few timbers, maybe some cargo, occasionally a well-preserved section of hull. But in Heracleion, Gaudio's team found between 64 and 79 ships, complete shipwrecks, ranging from the 6th century to the 2nd century BCE, all resting exactly where they sank, preserved by the same protective silt that saved the statues and temples. It's the largest assemblage of ancient boats ever discovered in one location. Think about what that represents. These weren't just ships that happened to sink near Heracleion. These were the city's working vessels. Cargo ships, trading vessels, possibly ceremonial boats, used in religious processions. The physical evidence of how this port city actually functioned. And because they're so well preserved, they tell us things that written records can't. One of the most remarkable discoveries came between 2009 and 2011, when the team excavated a ship that perfectly matched a description written by Herodotus in 450 BCE. Herodotus had described a type of Egyptian Nile boat called a barus. He'd written about how these boats were constructed, what materials were used, how the planks were joined together. He'd been quite specific about the details, actually, almost technical. For centuries, scholars had read those passages and wondered if Herodotus had gotten it right. Ancient historians were known for embellishing, for including details that sounded plausible but might not be accurate. Without physical evidence, you couldn't be sure. And then they found one, an actual barus, right there in Heracleion. And when the marine archaeologists examined the construction, they realized that Herodotus's description was essentially perfect. He documented the building technique accurately, the way the planks were assembled, the type of wood used, the method of waterproofing, all of it matched. It was a small moment, in a way, just confirming an ancient text, but it represented something larger, the reliability of ancient sources. When historians like Herodotus wrote about what they saw, they were often more accurate than modern scholars gave them credit for. The physical ship proved the written word. More recently, in 2021, the team made another significant discovery: a 25-meter Ptolemaic galley, a rowing vessel with a sail, built during the period when Greek Ptolemaic rulers controlled Egypt. This ship was particularly interesting because of how it combined building techniques. The Greeks had a traditional shipbuilding method, using something called mortise and tenon construction. You'd carve interlocking joints in the wooden planks, fitting them together like puzzle pieces to create a strong, watertight hull. It was sophisticated, effective, and had been used throughout the Mediterranean for centuries. The Egyptians had their own approach. They typically built flat-bottomed boats better suited for river use. Different design principles, different construction methods. And this Ptolemaic galley? It used both. Greek mortise and tenon joinery combined with Egyptian flat-bottom design. A hybrid. A ship that represented the cultural fusion we've been talking about. Two civilizations learning from each other, adapting each other's techniques, creating something new that drew from both traditions. You can see the collaboration in the physical structure of the ship. Greek craftsmanship and Egyptian know-how working together. But the ship's preservation told another story too. This galley had been trapped under massive temple blocks when part of Heracleion's sacred architecture collapsed. The falling stones had basically created a protective shelter over the ship. So while other vessels might have been exposed to currents or degraded over time, this one was sealed away, protected by the very destruction that had damaged it. It's another example of how catastrophe and preservation went hand in hand. in Heracleion. Beyond the complete ships, the team found over 700 anchors scattered across the site. 700. They're arranged in what archaeologists describe as an organized pattern, almost like parking spaces, as if ancient harbor masters had designated specific spots where ships could drop anchor. The maritime equivalent of a parking lot, stretching across the seafloor, still marking where vessels once waited to load or unload cargo. Each anchor tells a small story. They come in different styles, different sizes. Some are Egyptian in design, some are clearly Greek. Some represent styles from other Mediterranean cultures, Phoenician, perhaps, or from various Greek island colonies. All of them ended up here, in Heracleon's harbor, physical evidence of the international trade that flowed through this city. Ships from across the known world, all anchored here, all participating in the exchange of goods and ideas that made Heracleion essential. The ships and anchors together paint a picture of a working port, not just the monumental architecture and colossal statues, but the everyday maritime activity. The constant movement of vessels, the loading of cargo, the inspection by harbor authorities, the mix of different cultures, different shipbuilding traditions, different commercial practices, all converging in this one location. It's the difference between reading about a bustling port city and seeing the actual evidence of that activity. Written sources might say Heracleion was an important trade center, but when you find dozens of ships from different periods, hundreds of anchors from different regions, cargo from across the Mediterranean, then you really understand what important trade center actually meant. The ships also reveal how long Heracleion remained active. The wrecks date from the 6th century BCE through the 2nd century BCE. That's 400 years of continuous maritime activity, documented not in historical texts, but in the physical remains of the vessels themselves. And because the ships are so well preserved, future research will reveal even more. Wood can be analyzed to determine where the trees grew, which tells you where the ship was built. Construction techniques can be studied in detail, revealing how shipbuilding evolved over time. Cargo can identify trade routes, economic patterns, what goods were valuable enough to transport. The ships of Heracleion are still teaching us, still revealing secrets about the ancient Mediterranean world. But among all the impressive finds, the colossal statues, the numerous ships, the temple foundations, there was one discovery that brought researchers back to the question we started with. That fruit basket. Those doum nuts and grape seeds that survived 2,400 years underwater, they came from a specific place, an underground chamber that had been sealed and never reopened. And that chamber raised questions that archaeologists are still trying to answer. Underground chambers in ancient cities aren't unusual. Storage rooms, crypts, foundation spaces beneath temples, places where sacred objects were kept, where offerings were placed, where rituals happened away from public view. But the chamber discovered in Heracleion is different. It's what was found inside that makes it remarkable, and it's what wasn't found that makes it mysterious. When archaeologists excavated this underground space, they found those wicker baskets we talked about at the beginning, the ones with doum nuts and grape seeds still inside, organic material that had survived 2,400 years underwater because this chamber had been sealed, creating stable conditions that prevented decay. But the baskets weren't the only things there. They found Greek ceramics, beautiful pieces, carefully crafted, probably valuable when they were placed there, the kind of pottery that would have been used in religious ceremonies, for holding offerings or libations. They found evidence of burned offerings, the residue of materials that had been ritually burned, probably as part of a ceremony. Fire and smoke were common elements in ancient religious practice ways of sending offerings to the gods, of purifying spaces, of marking important transitions. All of this suggests a ceremonial purpose. This wasn't a storage room. It wasn't a crypt. It was a ritual space, a place where something important happened. But here's the puzzling part. Everything in that chamber dates to the early 4th century BCE, around 350 to 400 BCE. And nothing in the chamber dates to later than that, which means that sometime in the early 4th century BCE, people placed offerings in this underground chamber, performed a ceremony that involved burning certain materials, left fruit in baskets, sealed the space, and never came back, never reopened it, never added more offerings, just sealed it and left it alone. And the city continued functioning for another 600 years. Think about that timeline. The chamber was sealed around 400 BCE. Heracleion remained inhabited, at least partially, until the 8th century CE. That's 1,200 years, where people lived in this city, worked in these temples, performed religious ceremonies, and that chamber stayed closed. Whatever happened in that space, whatever ritual or ceremony led to it being sealed, it was meant to be permanent. We don't know why. There are theories, of course. Maybe it was connected to a specific religious festival or ceremony that was discontinued. Maybe it marked the end of a particular cult practice. Maybe it was related to political changes, the transition from Egyptian to Greek rule, or from Greek independence to Ptolemaic control. Or maybe it was something we don't have any record of. A ritual practice that was specific to Heracleion, that died when the city did, that we can only glimpse through the physical evidence left behind. That's the thing about archaeology. Sometimes you find answers. You discover an artifact that confirms what ancient texts described, or you uncover evidence that solves a historical puzzle. And sometimes you find new mysteries. The sealed chamber is one of those mysteries. We know what was in it. We can analyze the materials, date the objects, study the construction, but we can't know why it was sealed or what it meant to the people who performed that final ceremony. There's something beautiful about that in a way. Not all questions need answers. Not everything from the ancient world can be explained or understood through our modern lens. Some things remain mysterious, and maybe that's appropriate. The chamber waited underwater for 2,400 years, sealed and undisturbed, holding its secrets. And even now that we've opened it, studied the contents, analyzed the materials, the essential question remains. Why did they seal it? What were they marking? What were they ending? What did this space mean? We might never know, but what we do know is that the preservation was extraordinary. The fact that organic materials survived at all is remarkable. The fact that they survived well enough to identify, to distinguish down nuts from other seeds, to recognize grape remains, to understand what had been placed there, that's almost miraculous. It tells us something about the conditions inside that sealed chamber. The lack of oxygen, the stable temperature, the protection from water movement and disturbance, all the factors that normally destroy organic materials were absent here. The chamber became a time capsule, accidentally, perhaps, or maybe intentionally. Maybe the people who sealed it understood, at some level, that they were preserving something, creating a record that would outlast them by millennia. We'll probably never know their intentions, but we benefit from the result. Those fruit baskets, those ceramics, those traces of burned offerings, they give us a glimpse into religious practices that otherwise would have been lost completely. We have written records of some Egyptian and Greek ceremonies, yes, but written records can be incomplete, biased, misunderstood. Physical evidence is different. It's tangible. real. These are the actual objects that were used, the actual materials that were burned, the actual fruit that was offered. It's as close as we can get to being there, to witnessing what happened in that underground chamber in the 4th century BCE. And it's all because of an accident of preservation, because the chamber was sealed, because the city sank, because protective silt covered everything, because conditions happened to be exactly right for organic materials to survive. So many factors had to align. If the chamber had been reopened at any point, the contents would have decayed. If the city had been abandoned rather than submerged, looters would have found it. If the silt hadn't covered it precisely the right way, oxygen and organisms would have destroyed the organic materials. But all those factors did align, and 2,400 years later, archaeologists opened wicker baskets and found fruit from ancient Egypt, still identifiable. It's the kind of discovery that reminds you why archaeology matters, why it's worth spending decades carefully excavating underwater sites, why patience and precision and respect for these fragile remains are essential. Because sometimes, if you're careful enough, if you're lucky enough, if conditions align just right, you can reach across 2.5 millennia and touch something that ancient hands placed there. You can hold evidence of a ceremony you'll never fully understand, performed by people whose names are lost, in a city that vanished from human memory for over 1,000 years. And in that moment, the past feels very close. The sealed chamber reminds us of something important. For all we've discovered about Heracleion, for all the statues and ships and artifacts that have been brought to the surface, we've barely scratched the surface, literally. After 25 years of continuous excavation work, Gaudio estimates that his team has explored about 5% of the city. 5%. Heracleion covers 3.5 square kilometers of ocean floor. That's roughly the equivalent of 490 football fields, if you need a comparison, or about 860 acres. However you measure it, it's massive, and it's all underwater, covered by 30 feet of Mediterranean water and several more feet of protective silt. Every artifact, every structure, every street and building and temple is buried beneath layers of sediment that have to be carefully, slowly, painstakingly removed. To put that in perspective, Pompeii, probably the most famous archaeological site in the world, covers about 1.2 square kilometers. It's been excavated since the 1700s. That's over 250 years of work. And there are still sections of Pompeii that haven't been fully explored. Heracleion is 3 times that size, and it's underwater, which means every challenge that land archaeologists face is multiplied. You can't see as well. You can't stay at the site as long. You can't easily bring equipment in. You have to worry about currents, tides, storms, marine life, the corrosive effects of salt water on tools and artifacts. When Gaudio was asked how long it would take to fully excavate Heracleion, his answer was sobering. 200 years. 200 years of continuous, careful, patient work. At the current pace, generations of archaeologists will spend their entire careers working on this site. People who haven't been born yet will make discoveries there. Technologies that don't exist yet will be used to analyze what's found. The work that's happening now, in the 2020s, represents just the beginning of a process that will extend well into the 23rd century. That's a strange thing to consider. The idea that this discovery is so large, so complex, so time-consuming, that it will outlive everyone currently working on it, and their children, and probably their grandchildren. It requires a particular kind of patience, a long view of time that goes against our modern instincts for speed and completion. But Gaudio and his team have embraced that patience. They've adopted a philosophy that might seem counterintuitive. Touch as little as possible. Learn as much as you can while disturbing as little as you can. And, when in doubt, leave things for future archaeologists who will have better tools, better techniques, better understanding. It's almost the opposite of treasure hunting. Treasure hunters want to extract as much as possible, as quickly as possible. But careful archaeology is about preservation first, discovery second. Because once you excavate something, you can't put it back. Once you remove an artifact from its context, that context is destroyed. The relationship between objects, the layers of sediment, the position of items relative to each other, all of that tells a story. And once it's disturbed, that story can't be fully recovered. So the team moves slowly, methodically. They document everything before they touch it. They photograph, measure, map. They analyze in place when possible. And they make conscious decisions about what to excavate and what to leave for later. It's a level of discipline that's hard to maintain when you're discovering things that nobody has seen in over 1,000 years. The temptation to explore further, to uncover more, to satisfy curiosity must be enormous. But they resist that temptation because they know that the city will outlast them. That Heracleion has waited 1,200 years already. It can wait a bit longer, and that patience is already paying off. Technology that didn't exist when the excavation began in 2000 has already changed what's possible. Better underwater cameras, more sophisticated sonar mapping, improved preservation techniques for fragile artifacts, digital modeling that can recreate structures without having to fully excavate them. In another 20 years, there will be tools we can't even imagine right now. Methods of analysis that seem like science fiction today. Ways of learning from artifacts without disturbing them at all. So by leaving 95% of the city unexplored, the team isn't admitting defeat. They're making a choice. They're prioritizing long-term understanding over short-term discovery. But that 95% haunts the imagination, doesn't it? If 5% of the city has yielded colossal statues, dozens of ships, sealed chambers with preserved organic materials, hundreds of anchors, temple foundations, and countless artifacts, what's in the other 95%? Are there larger statues still buried? Other sealed chambers with different contents? Royal tombs? Libraries? Administrative buildings with records that might rewrite our understanding of this period? We don't know. And we won't know for generations. But that's also strangely comforting. It means the story of Heracleion is far from over. There are discoveries waiting that will surprise researchers 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. It means that people far in the future will experience the same wonder that the current excavation team feels. That moment of uncovering something that's been hidden for millennia. That connection to the ancient past through objects that bridge time. The 5% that's been explored has already transformed our understanding of ancient Egypt, of Greek-Egyptian cultural exchange, of Mediterranean trade, of religious practices, of shipbuilding, of how civilizations interact. The 95% waiting to be discovered will probably transform it again and again and again. Each generation of archaeologists will add to the picture. Each discovery will reveal something new, challenge some assumption, confirm some theory, raise new questions. And that process, that slow, patient, multi-generational process of revelation, is exactly how archaeology should work. Not as a race to uncover everything as quickly as possible, but as a careful conversation with the past, one that takes as long as it needs to take, one that values understanding over extraction, one that leaves room for future questions and future discoveries. Heracleion has been patient. It waited 1,200 years to be found. It can wait another 200 to be fully understood. And in the meantime, what we've learned already is extraordinary. About how cities fall, about how cultures merge, about what survives when everything else is forgotten. There's something profound about Heracleion's story that goes beyond archaeology. It's about impermanence, about what lasts and what doesn't, about how even the most important, most powerful, most essential things can simply vanish. For hundreds of years, Heracleion was indispensable. If you wanted to trade with Egypt, you came through this city. If you were a pharaoh seeking divine authority, you came to its temples. If you were Greek living in Egypt or Egyptian working with Greeks, this was where cultures met and mixed. It wasn't peripheral. It wasn't optional. It was central to how a major civilization connected with the wider world. And then, gradually, it wasn't. Alexandria rose. Trade routes shifted. The ground literally gave way. And over the course of centuries, Heracleion slipped from essential to secondary, to abandoned to forgotten. By the time the last residents left, probably in the 8th century, the city's glory was already distant memory. And within a few more generations, it wasn't even that. It was just gone from human knowledge. For 1,200 years, one of the ancient world's major ports existed only as scattered mentions in old texts, references that most people dismissed as confused or mythical or unreliable. It's humbling to think about. If a city that important could be completely forgotten, what else have we lost? What other civilizations, cultures, achievements have disappeared so thoroughly that we don't even know they existed? Heracleion was lucky, in a way. It was mentioned in texts. Historians like Herodotus and Strabo wrote about it, so when it was rediscovered, we could connect the physical ruins to the historical record. We could say, yes, this is the place. This is what they were describing. But how many cities weren't written about? How many cultures left no texts? Or left texts that didn't survive? How much of human history is simply missing? We'll never know the full answer to that question. By definition, you can't know what you don't know. But Heracleion offers a different kind of lesson too, about preservation, about what survives against all odds. The same catastrophe that destroyed the city also saved it. The liquefaction that pulled temples and statues into the earth also sealed them away from looters and weather, and the slow degradation that affects surface ruins. The mud and silt that buried everything created perfect preservation conditions. Destruction and preservation happening together. Opposite forces working in concert. And now, 2,400 years after its founding, 1,200 years after its abandonment, 25 years after its rediscovery, we can see Heracleion again, not as it was at its height, perhaps, but as it was when it fell. A frozen moment, a snapshot of a civilization in the process of ending. That's rare in archaeology. Usually, ancient cities get reused, built over, dismantled for building materials, gradually picked apart by time and people. The ruins we find are fragments, foundations, scattered artifacts, mixed with later periods. But Heracleion sank all at once, relatively speaking. And once it was underwater, it was left alone. No medieval builders quarrying stone from ancient temples. No centuries of foot traffic wearing away mosaics. No gradual accumulation of newer structures burying the older ones. Just the city, settling into its final position, and then waiting. That accidental preservation means we have something close to a complete record. Streets laid out as they were. Buildings in their original positions. artifacts where they were left when people abandoned them. It's as close as archaeology gets to a time machine, and what it shows us is both beautiful and melancholy. Beautiful because the craftsmanship, the art, the evidence of human creativity and skill is extraordinary. Those 16-foot statues didn't carve themselves. The ships weren't built by accident. The temples and sanctuaries represented generations of knowledge, tradition, devotion. Melancholy because all of it ended. All those skilled craftspeople, all those ship captains and merchants and priests and laborers and families, all the accumulated knowledge about how to navigate the Mediterranean, how to conduct ceremonies, how to negotiate between Egyptian and Greek cultures, all the individual human lives that made Heracleion what it was, gone. Not destroyed violently, like Pompeii, not conquered and burned, like Troy, just gradually abandoned as the ground failed and the sea advanced and the city became uninhabitable. There's something almost gentle about that ending. Sad, yes, but not tragic in the dramatic sense. Just the natural conclusion of geological forces and changing trade patterns, and the slow, patient movement of earth and water. And now it's coming back. Slowly, carefully, 5% rediscovered, 95% waiting. Each artifact that surfaces adds to our understanding. Each ship, each statue, each sealed chamber tells us something about who these people were, what they valued, how they lived. But it also reminds us that we're temporary. Our cities, our civilizations, our certainties about what's important, all of it is subject to forces we can't always control. Geological shifts, climate changes, economic transformations, the slow accumulation of small changes that eventually add up to something fundamental. Heracleion isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror, a reminder that the cities we think are permanent might not be. That coastlines change, that what seems solid economically, geologically, culturally can shift. There are modern parallels, of course, rising sea levels, coastal cities at risk, the reality that climate and geography don't respect human plans or desires. But the lesson of Heracleion isn't really about fear or warning. It's about perspective, about understanding that change is constant, that civilizations rise and fall, that sometimes the ground beneath you, literally or figuratively, stops being solid, and also that things can survive in unexpected ways, that what seems lost can be found. That patience and careful attention can recover what was thought gone forever. Heracleion was forgotten for 1,200 years, and then someone started searching, and it wasn't forgotten anymore. The city still has secrets, still has stories to tell, still holds 95% of its evidence beneath protective layers of silt. But it's not lost, not anymore. And that's a kind of triumph against time, against forgetting, against the forces that would erase everything. Something remains and will continue to remain, waiting for patient archaeologists, waiting for curious scholars, waiting for people who want to understand how the ancient world worked and what happened when it didn't. The work continues. Right now, as you're listening to this, Heracleion is still there, 30 feet beneath the Mediterranean. 95% of it still buried beneath protective layers of silt, still holding its secrets, still waiting. And somewhere archaeologists are probably planning the next excavation season, reviewing data from the last dive, analyzing artifacts that were brought up months or years ago, slowly, patiently, adding to our understanding of this remarkable city. It's not dramatic work, most of the time. not like the movies suggest. There are no torch-lit chases through ancient tunnels, no curse-breaking or treasure maps, just careful documentation, precise measurements, hours spent underwater in near darkness, gently brushing silt away from objects that haven't been touched in millennia, long stretches in conservation labs, treating fragile materials so they don't disintegrate when exposed to air. It's patient work, methodical work, the kind that takes years to show results and generations to complete. But it's also important work, because every artifact that surfaces tells us something. Every ship that's documented adds to our understanding of ancient maritime technology. Every statue helps us see how the Egyptians and Greeks imagined their gods. Every sealed chamber offers glimpses of ritual practices we might never fully understand. Heracleion is teaching us. Still, after 25 years of excavation, after dozens of major discoveries, after transforming our understanding of how ancient civilizations interacted at the crossroads of cultures, and it will keep teaching us for the next 200 years. And probably beyond that. Because this is a city that waited 1,200 years to be found. It can afford to be patient about revealing itself. Think back to that wicker basket for a moment. The one with doum nuts and grape seeds. Sitting in an underground chamber for 2,400 years, waiting for archaeologists in diving gear to carefully open it and discover fruit from ancient Egypt. That basket is a perfect metaphor for Heracleion itself. Something that survived against all odds. Something that was lost and then found. Something that bridges unimaginable stretches of time, connecting us to people who lived in a world so different from ours that it's almost impossible to comprehend. And yet, through objects like that basket, through the ships they built and the statues they carved and the cities they inhabited, we can touch that world. We can understand it, at least partially. We can recognize ourselves in their creativity, their devotion, their work, their daily lives. The people of Heracleion are gone. Their names, mostly forgotten. Their individual stories, lost. But what they built, what they made, what they left behind, that remains. Transformed by time and submersion and geological forces, yes, but recognizable, real, present. And as long as archaeologists continue the slow, careful work of excavation and preservation, more of that presence will emerge. More statues will rise from the seafloor. More ships will be documented. More chambers will be explored. More mysteries will be discovered. And some of them will be solved. And some will remain mysteries, waiting for future understanding or simply persisting as questions we can't answer. That's all right. Not everything needs to be understood immediately. Not every question requires an answer. Heracleion has taught us that patience is valuable, that slow, careful work yields results that quick extraction never could, that sometimes the best choice is to leave things buried, to wait for better technology, to trust that future archaeologists will continue what we've started. It's a lesson worth remembering. In archaeology, yes, but maybe in other things too. That some processes can't be rushed, that some understanding comes only with time, that patience, even over centuries, can be rewarded. The city rests beneath the Mediterranean, the blue-green waters moving gently overhead, the protective silt settling around ancient stones, the statues lying where they fell when the ground became liquid, the ships resting in their final positions, the chambers sealed and waiting. And slowly, piece by piece, all of that is being revealed, brought back to light, returned to human knowledge after 1,200 years of absence. It's not a race. It's not even a destination, really. It's a process, an ongoing conversation with the past, one that we're having now and that others will continue long after we're gone. Heracleion waited to be found, and now it waits to be understood, and it does so patiently. The way cities made of stone can wait, the way ancient things wait, having already survived everything that time could throw at them. The fruit basket that waited 2,400 years, the god of flooding, resting at the bottom of the sea. The Venice of the Nile, transformed into an underwater archaeological park. The city where pharaohs became gods, now a place where archaeologists become historians, carefully reconstructing a world we thought was lost forever. All of it waiting, all of it patient, all of it still there beneath 30 feet of Mediterranean water, ready to reveal whatever secrets remain in that 95% that we haven't yet touched. And that's where we'll leave it. Waiting, patient, still holding most of its mysteries, still teaching us, slowly, about how civilizations rise and fall and, sometimes, against all odds, come back. Sleep well, and when you wake, Heracleion will still be there, still waiting, still slowly revealing itself to anyone patient enough to listen to what it has to say.